Great. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you all might be. And welcome to the OPR Civil Society and US-China Relations panel. Thank you, all four of you, again, for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have all of you. And thank you to our viewers. You are all in a special treat today with this group of incredible people. A quick introduction about myself and OPR. I'm Michael Shao, your humble moderator. I graduated from the University of Oxford in 2020 with a bachelor's in philosophy, politics, and economics. Together with Brian Wong, Chang Che, and Nicholas Lea, we've been working on OPR since 2019. We do a lot of things, but I'd say one of the most interesting things we do is to do what we can to bring a voice to wonderful people like the panelists we have today, and to provide your views for discussion to our readership and really whoever bothers to take the time to read. Without further ado, allow me to have the great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Yawei Liu is the Senior Advisor on China at the Carter Center and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is also the Associate Director of the China Research Center in Atlanta and an Adjunct Professor of Political Science at Emory University. He launched the US-China Perception Monitor websites in 2014. Yawei earned his bachelor's in English literature from the Xi'an Foreign Languages Institute, his master's in recent Chinese history from the University of Hawaii, and a PhD in American history from Emory University. Dr. Liu has written for us before on democracy in China, why justice for George Floyd matters, and how the United States must acknowledge how racial prejudice contours the China challenge it faces today. You can check out his writing with us at oxfordpoliticalreview.com. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Liu. Kerry Brown is Professor of Chinese Studies and Director of the Lau China Institute at King's College London. He is an Associate of the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House, London. From 2012 to 2015, he was Professor of Chinese Politics and Director of the China Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, Australia. Prior to this, he worked at Chatham House from 2006 to 2012 as Senior Fellow and then Head of the Asia Program. From 1998 to 2005, he worked at the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office as First Secretary at the British Embassy in Beijing, and then as Head of the Indonesia, Philippine, and East Timor section. He previously graduated from Cambridge University and has a PhD in Chinese politics and language from Leeds University. He's the author of almost 20 books on modern Chinese politics. He has recently been awarded the China Cultural Exchange Person of the Year. Professor Brown has written for OPR on the nuances between the people of China and the Chinese Communist Party. And thanks for being with us today, Professor Brown. Emily Feng is NPR's Beijing correspondent. Feng joined NPR in February 2019. She works across an extensive range of issues and domains, reporting on a mixture of social trends as well as economic and political news coming out of Beijing. Emily contributes to NPR's news magazines, newscasts, podcasts, and digital platforms. From 2017 through 2019, Emily was a foreign correspondent for the Financial Times. Based in Beijing, she covered a broad range of topics, including politics, civil society, human rights, technology, and the environment. Thank you for being with us today, Emily. Susan A. Thornton is a retired senior U.S. diplomat with nearly 3 decades with the U.S. State Department in Asia. She's currently a senior fellow and research scholar at the Paul Tsai China Center at Yale University Law School, the director of the Forum on Asia-Pacific Security at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. Thornton had served as acting assistant secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the Department of State and facilitated or crafted the American response to crises, including tensions in the Korean Peninsula, escalating trade conflicts with China, amidst a rapidly shifting international environment. Thank you so much for being with us today, Professor Thornton. So today's topic is civil society and US-China relations. Very briefly for our viewers, I'll explain the idea of civil society, even though we all understand it to have a variety of definitions. According to the World Bank, civil society refers to a wide array of organizations, community groups, non-governmental organizations, labor unions, indigenous groups, charitable organizations, faith-based organizations, professional associations, and foundations, and more. I think we often understand it as the third sector after government and business, including family and the aforementioned groups of the private sphere of society. Well, then let's get started, shall we? So we would like to begin today's conversation with a general question based on something that happened very recently. The Biden administration, just a few weeks ago, has promised that there will be extreme competition with China, but has also stated that they won't take a, quote, Trump approach. We'd like each speaker to explain to the audience what they think that means in practical terms. How will Biden's approach differ from Trump? And what role does the actors that are contained in civil society, like NGOs and journalists, have in mediating those conflicts? Let's start with Yawei.
By the way, can you ask your technical person to check the Zoom? I think someone in China told me that they couldn't see it. But
okay.
Thanks, Michael, for the introduction. I think, I don't exactly know what President Trump means by, we're in extreme competition with China. I mean, what about the last 4 years? The U.S. is not in competition with China. I think the Chinese position is very clear. Basically, the Chinese leaders repeatedly since the summer of 2020 told the American side that, we don't want to challenge your supremacy. We think the relationship is very important. We also think the relationship may not be breakable. But we also believe that you have to respect our system, our leaders, what we do in Hong Kong, in Xinjiang, in Taiwan. We also want the so-called democratization of the international relations. We want multilateralism. So that's where the China side is coming from. And China side also famously or infamously proposed the three lists: the list of cooperation, the list of dialogue, and the list of things that both sides have to learn to manage. I think the U.S. position is also clear. It's we're going to build back better. We are going to renew or strengthen the unprecedented global network of alliances and partners. And, we're going to focus on values. But then specifically, I don't know what both sides are exactly doing. And it's not clear. It looks like the tariff is not going to go. And nobody has taken the initiative in terms of, that's build back our relationship. We're going to do this. Neither side has done anything. And finally, on the competition issue, I think as we understand competition, it's basically like athletes, in the Olympic Games, you want to run faster, you want to jump higher, but you're not going to trip other people. And the Chinese perception of American competition, particularly extreme competition, means we're going to trip you. We're going to do so much to crush you that you're not going to be able even to compete with us. So I'll stop here.
Great, thanks, Yawei. Could we hear from Susan next?
Thanks, Michael, and great to be here with all of you this morning. My perception is that a lot of the current state of affairs has to do in a way with sort of the trajectory of U.S. domestic politics over recent years. It used to be, of course, that people in the U.S. and in policymaking circles in Washington and many people who were involved in China from the United States were thinking that they were engaged in a mission to change China. We sort of, since 1979 and the normalization, have been thinking that there were, by engaging China, by bringing China into the international community, by binding it into the international system, somehow we were going to fundamentally change the character of this nation civilization. I think, that was probably pretty far-fetched. And, a lot of people are arguing now about the state of engagement and whether that was really the object of it or not. But, as we were having that conversation, the notion in the United States has somehow changed 180 degrees to the side where we say, we can have absolutely no influence on China. It's completely impervious to our influence. And I think that that's sort of where we are now. And that's where this notion of extreme competition comes from. And, from my perspective, really, these two views, this view that, we have to change China, the fundamental character, in order for them to be able to have a normal relationship with us, or we have to sort of, can have absolutely no impact on them, and therefore have to treat the relationship as some kind of zero-sum contest, are both obviously caricatures and wrong. And, working in diplomatic work with lots of governments around the world, some of which are a lot more difficult than China, I think it's just unrealistic, the kind of notion that we are operating from now. And I hope to see, I think you see some early indications of this, of the Biden administration moving toward a more nuanced view, which is this sort of multifaceted picture that you hear Tony Blinken talk about, and which actually comes a bit closer to the European view of things, which is that, we can collaborate with China on areas where we should. We have to compete with them in areas where we have competition, but it doesn't have to be zero sum. And then there are some areas where we have fundamental disagreements. And I think that is probably the direction that we're moving in. But I agree with Yawei that it's taking a bit of time and it's moving very slowly. And it really seems like the administration at the moment is kind of taking stock around the world with its allies and avoiding the conversation with China, which I think is unfortunate. So maybe I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan. Could I just quickly remind our speakers to mute themselves when not speaking, just because there's a bit of a feedback, but otherwise, thank you. Next, could we please hear from Emily?
I think that all of us are largely in accord. The question now is how well the Biden administration and China can compartmentalize the various issues that they've said they can work on, and other issues which there seem to be wiggle room on, but so far doesn't seem to be any potential for collaboration. And I think there's been some dispiriting signs from both China and DC, particularly the State Department in the US, where the real issues that the US cares about, where there's still sort of a, I think, false hope that they can change Beijing's mind. Those issues being what's happening in Xinjiang, about the state of affairs in Hong Kong, that somehow that's within Washington's purview to change Beijing's mind about. From the very outset of the Biden administration, I think China's already signaled that those are, to quote their words, red lines. And after coronavirus is over, after the US has vaccinated all of its population, perhaps we can see whether climate change and some of the public health related measures that the US and China have talked about are issues where there can be cooperation, but I'm not particularly optimistic. I think the best case scenario is that we have an uneasy peace where the US manages to keep China in many of its multilateral and financial institutions, and the two sides find some kind of equilibrium to coexist. I can talk more specifically about what I hope for information access and foreign journalists on the ground. I'm a little bit more optimistic on that front, but I think that will also closely track what happens in the overall bilateral relationship.
Thanks, Emily. And finally, could we hear from Kerry?
Great, yeah, and thank you too for inviting me today. It's great to see so many esteemed colleagues, so thank you very much. I'll say three things. One is about structure, the second is about size of the problem, and then the third about this sort of issue of ambiguity. I think a strategic ambiguity. I mean, one thing I found helpful recently is to think, okay, well, we can think about the sort of cultural and ethical issues between China and the US in particular, but let's think about the structure. So the proposition is that, the world's biggest capitalist is going to be a communist. This is just in gross size in terms of the size of the economy. I presume China is going to be the world's biggest economy soon, maybe sooner than we expected, unless there's some total calamity. And, that's a sort of weird structure. You've got a game that was set up, the game of capitalism, where you've got this player coming who's extremely good at it, but there's all sorts of suspicions about whether they're playing that game fairly. It's almost like one of these kind of, someone mentioned, I think Yawei mentioned about, kind of running a marathon where, you have someone come along who's maybe got some access to some super drug that makes them run faster, but no one can quite nail it down. What is this? So I guess we have to understand how it is that a communist system is so successful in terms of being a capitalist actor. I mean, that's really extraordinary. The second is about the size. The US-China relationship is one that I think used to be fairly kind of discreet. It was a huge and important area, but it was one where I think both sides were quite jealous of their relations with each other, probably rightly so. No one likes people interfering in their relationships. And I think now there's an acknowledgement that this issue transcends country boundaries because of the structural issues I just talked about, but also the fact that the US issues with China can't be dealt with by the US alone, which I presume is why there is this China dialogue with the EU now, for instance. And also the fact that China's issues with the United States are also ones where it has to kind of have conversations with India and others. I mean, this was always true, but I think now it's starkly true. The problem can't be solved by any one actor. I mean, even if it ever could be solved, it certainly can't now. So I think that makes for a sort of fairly hybrid diplomacy. The final thing is about this issue of ambiguity. I mean, I think Susan, as someone who dealt with policy before, I mean, all of us, who dealt with policy a bit, I mean, policy doesn't like ambiguity. It's got to create clarity. What do you have policy for except, to create sort of neat frameworks to deal with issues if you can. And of course, the issue with China is that it's the ultimate ambiguous actor. I mean, it is enormously important for climate change, for human, public health, sustainability, economic development. But it is enormously problematic for areas of values, what's happening in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, these are very confronting. And domestic issues in China and China's way of relating, in the Belt and Road, all of these areas, it's pretty clear that this is an enormous cause of ambiguity. I mean, I kind of think a good metaphor for this is, I suppose, the unipolar world was a bungalow and we're moving into a two-story house, and the big problem is that most accidents happen on the stairs, right? So you've got this stairway, this series of stairways between two floors. And, all of them are going to be very different in the challenges they pose. Some of them, as Yawei said about the three areas the Chinese pointed out, I guess are going to be navigable. Others are just going to be blocked. And I think that is a messy world, but it's a possible world. I can't see, and I agree with Susan, I cannot see how you can have a completely disconnected world. That's not going to work. So messy hybridity is probably where we're going to end up and where we're heading into. And I think finally, to expect the Biden administration to be able to act, with a great deal of clarity here is pretty impossible. I think we should have low expectations, but we should at least hope that we can live with this messiness and have some areas which are prioritized, like climate change, sorted out, as well as could be in others. I think we're going to have long-term tensions and probably unresolvable tensions. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Brown. So we've heard about, a lot of topics, I think, from this introductory question. So there's a lot of things that we can continue to talk about. I think one thing we'd like to start with is, the four of you have discussed how to, prevent a total breakdown in relations between the US and China, how to think of the problem itself, of the structure. We've heard from Susan, Kerry, Yawei, Emily, all four of you really, about how, going forward in the Biden administration, a lot of things need to be thought about. One thing I would like for you four to consider and to talk about is the civil societies between, US and Chinese society, more specifically, kind of American perceptions of China at the moment. There's a recent poll that came out showing that US public opinion on China is lower now than it was immediately following the events in 1989, which I found very surprising. What does this suggest about the prospects of improving relations between the two, given that the perceptions now, not to put a downer on our conversation, but seems almost at an all-time low? Could we please hear from Susan first? And then following from there, anyone can really jump in to continue the discussion.
Yeah, thanks, Michael, and thanks for bringing this up, because this is really the point of greatest concern for me, actually. And, Chinese always say, they have this stock phrase about how, Chinese know more about the United States than Americans know about China. And well, why is that? I mean, it's because I think it's pretty easy to know about the United States, and it's pretty hard to know about China in many respects. If you look at the differences in sort of information access, media, etc., you can see how it would be so difficult for people to really be able to get what's going on in China. I mean, we all speak Chinese and are experts, and we can't figure out what's going on in China most of the time. So, I think the Chinese have to assume a certain amount of burden for the way things are developing. But clearly, there's also a lot of responsibility to be laid at the feet of, American political leaders, and I think, frankly, American media. Most Americans don't think that much about countries outside our borders on a day-to-day basis. Polling, you have to take it with a grain of salt because, of course, it depends on how the questions are asked and what the news headline is that day. But certainly, the Chinese are clearly making an effort on the part of their leadership to try to guide public opinion in China through the Trump administration, which was, of course, extreme rhetoric on the US side. And even now with the Biden administration, they're making efforts to try to guide public opinion to a place where, they can still maintain an equilibrium in US-China relations. Whereas, on the US side, you really don't see the same kind of effort to try to manage the rhetoric around US-China relations. And certainly on the part of the media, and social media, clearly, it's gotten a bit, out of control. And as a diplomat, I mean, I'm sure I have a certain bias around, polite discourse and respect and those kinds of things, which I think are still relevant for, humanity and society. And I look upon our current discourse with a certain amount of regret. But, I think that there is a responsibility for political leaders, especially because I don't think we can count so much on the general public to do the kind of research and in-depth work to try to make up their minds. And this is where I've been pretty disappointed, actually, so far with the rhetoric coming out of the U.S. administration. I think that there is room, despite the very narrow political space that they have on China right now. I think that there is room and there's a responsibility to try to bring back a certain level of, respect, at least, or a certain amount of equilibrium in the discourse with respect to China.
Could I jump in for three quick points?
Please.
Number one, I think on the perception issue, there's one thing that none of us can do anything about it. That's COVID. I think as long as COVID is around, it is associated with China. There's no way to get that out of people's mindset for now, regardless, what China has done and what US has done. That's not going to be easily overcome. The second issue is the credibility of the Chinese government. I always tell people, if you read speeches, be it Xi Jinping or Fu Ying or Wang Yi, any other, you think this is the greatest foreign policy of any country in the world. If China follows what they say in their speeches, no country is better than China. And then the question is, why no one believes in what they say? I think that's something China probably has to figure out. Is that a Jekyll and Hyde kind of? You say one thing, you do another, you have a split personality. The third issue, I think, is what's going on here in the US is there's just no way for you to say anything positive about China. If you do so, you're an enabler. I think Susan alluded to that is, the new debate may begin, particularly with Ryan Haas' book, on Stronger, is that, we don't need to be so scared and so resentful of China. I mean, we don't have to like China, but China is not going to. I think, let me quote President Biden here, even though his remarks got him into a lot of trouble. China is not going to steal our lunch. It's just not in that position to do so. But the thing is, that paranoia is there. And if you try to fix it, you're an enabler, you're bad, and you need to go down. And that's the political atmosphere here in the US. And it's pretty hard to reverse it for now. I think Biden administration can do a lot, as Susan has suggested.
Emily, would you like to jump in, or Kerry as well?
Sure, thanks, Gary. I think the biggest problem is a lack of trust. And this is at both the micro, person-to-person level, and macro, institutional level. So on the micro level, this is the lived reality of people working on the ground in China, or Chinese people who historically have exchange programs on a cultural, intellectual, trade level with the US. Here in China, I mean, as an American journalist, there is absolutely no trust of our Chinese counterparts, where there was a lot of goodwill before, and also no trust of American journalists. I mean, it's really difficult for me to get interviews with people. I'm sure people have read plenty of media coverage about how foreign correspondents are treated in China, but it's absolutely abysmal. And whereas I used to have a lot of exchanges with Chinese state media journalists, and they were always wonderful, really intelligent people, the last 2 years have been a series of very strange encounters with people whose identity and purpose I cannot fully ascertain, and it's been so disconcerting that at this point it is safer for me politically, and as a journalist who needs to maintain a certain distance from being associated with whatever particular state interest, to not have any exchanges with Chinese media whatsoever and certain Chinese think tanks. I'm sure that's true of a number of Chinese organizations that used to have links with American organizations. When you don't have that trust there, and everyone is operating on the basis of this person might have an ulterior motive other than just simply exchanging information and frank discourse about something, then it's very difficult to trust the agreements and the conversations that take place. And on a macro level, all of the big issues in the US-China relationship, whether it's technological standards and technological competition, or whether it's about taking China at its word that it's not trying to subvert the Western international order, is all about whether you call it a lack of credibility, a lack of trust. It's about a lack of trust. It's not taking China at its word when it's selling a country a nuclear power station, or when it's trying to set 5G standards. That all takes trust. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening in China, but China currently is shooting itself in the foot when it's trying to convince other countries and companies to buy really long-term products, big energy installations, or allowing them to come in and change all of your 4G mobile networks to 5G, things that last for the next 20 to 30 years, when it doesn't have that international trust there to back up what it's saying on paper, even though people might be very interested in doing so. And I see that manifesting at both the individual level with my work and on an institutional level with international relations. And unfortunately, it's very, very difficult to build that trust back up.
Yeah, I mean, that issue of trust, it's a really interesting thing to think about, because I think there was never trust there, really. I mean, there was always a lot of wariness and realism between the two, right from the time of Nixon and, kind of onwards. And I'm thinking, as you were speaking about, in 2001, when China joined the WTO, the World Trade Organization, I think Susan was serving in Beijing then, and I'm pretty sure our assessment was it would be very challenging for China. The implementation of everything, it would be a big challenge. I think we were pretty kind of sanguine, and I mean, of course, it did pretty well out of it. I mean, it did really well. And I don't know whether that. So there's an issue of the fact that China wasn't acting in bad faith. It didn't know that it would do that well. In doing that well, of course, it eroded, I think, our confidence in the long term. That we kind of, I guess Europe and America maybe thought, China wouldn't have the capacity to do what it did. And we've always priced into our analysis this idea that in the end, this whole thing is going to fall apart. It can't carry on. And today, of course, it's carrying on, and it looks like it's going to carry on and on and on. And so I'm not sure if that's an issue of trust. I think it's trust of, China. That's one problem, but trust of our own ability to read China. And to this issue of surveys, I mean, there was so the British, as world leaders, and I say this, of course, with great feeling and fondness, in hypocrisy. We can kind of, we can deal with hybridity, but at the moment, even we're finding it hard. With our Sinophile Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who's also dealing with, pretty critical people in his own party. I mean, the public surveys that have been done on British opinion towards China, there's not been many of them. We don't really want to know what we think about China, I don't think. And recently there was a survey by the Foreign Policy Centre, I think. And it was really stark, because if you're over 55, broadly Brexit voting, I mean, broadly that sort of socioeconomic demographic, and it's all spelt out in the Foreign Policy Centre report, you're going to have a very dim view of China, and it's getting dimmer. Actually, younger people are relatively open-minded and positive. And so that's an absolutely kind of typical clash between, these two groups that of course appeared during the referendum in 2016. And the only final thing I'll say is I have been, thinking a lot about, does knowledge help? The idea of our university centres disseminating knowledge about China. It's important. We have politicians, political figures who never had to think much about China and deal with China, and it's important to kind of, get a level of knowledge up. As Susan said, though, the problem is that you're dealing with an entity which does its level best to make itself unknowable. You've got a COVID-19 pandemic, which means that the kind of visits and contact we used to have so much with China, for very practical reasons, doesn't happen now, and is probably not going to happen easily for quite a while. So that's a big impediment. And finally, you had this sort of weird thing that sometimes, a little knowledge or even a good amount of knowledge is a problem, because there's knowledge and there's knowledge. And I find that there's a sort of very good industry in the UK for producing enormous amounts of knowledge about, I don't know, Hong Kong, for instance. And I'm not saying this knowledge isn't good, but it's not balanced by anything that might kind of put this in a bigger context. And I think that is a huge thing, to give context. To give knowledge is one thing, to give context is something completely different. And that's where the real battle starts.
Michael, could I come in just for a moment with a two-finger? I think one thing we need to keep in mind is that people outside China tend to see China as this very centrally driven, monolithic entity in the person kind of Xi Jinping. And I think, depending on what you're doing, that's a very kind of narrow and very kind of misleading impression of China. Now, China does a certain amount to perpetuate that. But I think if Emily was talking about the treatment of journalists. Certainly, if you're a journalist in China, you're going to have a certain view of things. But what I find in dealing with China is that and we're very stovepiped with respect to our views of China, depending on what we're doing. So if you talk to people who, for example, do business with China, or are talking to their counterparts or economic technocrats in China, or scientists in China, these relationships are full of trust. I mean, these people are practically, work colleagues. I mean, they speak the same language. They are very familiar to one another. But it's on the sort of political and security side where we have obviously huge gaps, and also I think on the information side. And so it's very stark, the difference and the sort of lack of understanding. I mean, there's a general population that has a shallow understanding, and they sort of read popular media maybe. But then among people who are actually experts, there's also a pretty big divide. So, for example, in the Obama administration, we had so much work going on between the United States and China on climate and energy issues. And these were, very close relationships. And I think still in the economic sphere, I mean, there's been some disappointment, and clearly the Trump era kind of magnified differences in certain unhealthy ways. But nevertheless, I think when we get back to a semblance of a sort of normal relationship post-COVID and post, whatever it is we're going through now with China, I think we'll still have this kind of disparate view of China in the community.
Thank you, Susan. I think we've heard, some great stuff about, the whole issue of perceptions and also of what we're going to do going forward. One thing I want to press on now is, a lot of what you guys have talked about is the things that can be done. So, first, I want to press on Emily, your specific experience as a journalist, right? Like, how has the things that have happened, like China's expulsion of US journalists, affected your coverage of China? What kind of effects do you think it'll have in the long term? And in addition to discussion on, where the state of things, what do you think should actually be done? It's obviously not necessarily an ideal situation, but if you could kind of, determine policy, what would you like to see happen? And then I'd also like to talk about afterwards, kind of, what we've heard, Kerry and Susan, you're both part of educational institutions. And Yawei, you brought up the idea of it being hard to say things that are positive about China, right, and how that's affected a lot of academics and other experts. But first, yes, if we could please hear from Emily.
Can you repeat the question you had for me again? How would I design policy regarding journalists? Oh, my experience on the ground.
Yeah, your experience on the ground. How has China's expulsion of US journalists affected your experience, and also what you think should be done?
Well, there's a very good report from the Foreign Correspondents Club, which just comes out. It's annual, on media freedoms and reporting conditions on the ground in China among foreign correspondents. And that has a bunch of anecdotes and information and statistics. But to summarize, at the end of the day, everyone loses out because there are fewer people covering more news than ever. And because of time scarcity, I really have to pick and choose which stories I cover. And there is inevitably an amount of bias in that. I choose stories that I find interesting personally, and I find interesting that I think will move the needle on issues that I care about. And that means that certain topics that are very worthwhile and need deeper understanding and explaining to American audiences don't get the attention they deserve. So when it comes to my preferences, I'm going to cover the stories that Chinese journalists at state media outlets cannot. And those are going to be the topics that China doesn't like, and the kind of topics that lead the foreign ministry to say that Western journalists are biased and out to smear China. They're going to be topics like human rights or environmental policies or national security issues, technological competition, etc. And that is my mission. I think those are the topics that are most important. And if you're looking for other news about China, there are plenty of other outlets that can cover those topics. In terms of what policies towards journalists can be, I say that I'm a bit more optimistic about the status of journalists in China and Chinese journalists in the US because there's such low-hanging fruit. I mean, the easiest thing to do would be to return back to the status quo. It would be to let the expelled journalists come back to China, let outstanding applications for new visas or replacements for journalists who have already left during COVID to get those visas and come back into China, to let outlets that were trying to open new bureaus in China open those bureaus. In general, I am for more information access and letting Chinese journalists in the US stay and have more Chinese journalists come to the US. Beyond that, there are major structural changes that could help foreign coverage of China. The first would be to give us longer visas and or not use visas as some kind of diplomatic retaliation strategy where you write a story that we don't like or your host country puts out a policy against China that they don't like, or your home country expels a bunch of Chinese journalists or investigates them at home, and all of a sudden your correspondents here in China get expelled. The other is we would love to be able to hire Chinese people as foreign correspondents, which we currently cannot do. We have to hire them indirectly through the foreign ministry, so their contract is officially with the foreign ministry. Their boss is the Chinese government, yet they're working for foreign media and they're getting flack from both sides. Those are, I think, the two biggest asks that we would have, and that would give us enormous latitude to cover China with much more experience and more resources.
Thank you, Emily. And, I think another aspect of the same conversation is that, Susan, you were talking earlier about how experts among themselves, tend to, from both sides, tend to, really work together in cohesion, but it's really, the political side that kind of causes a lot of the tension. Recently, I'm sure you're all aware of the story regarding Gang Chen, an MIT professor who's facing charges from the United States, but has also received very strong support from his colleagues. So how have tensions between these two countries affected both your experience and also, Professor Brown, your experience in academic institutions.
Well, I'll start. And I have to say that, following attacks on Asians in the United States over recent weeks, there's been a flood of attention at educational institutions in the United States, and all kinds of organizations are surrounding this sort of racist attacks and racially motivated violence against Asian Americans, or Asians in America, I should say. And I mean, this was something we saw, of course, right after the uptick in the pandemic in the United States, but it hasn't actually dissipated despite the Biden administration's pronouncements, and despite efforts to try to publicize this and to try to, raise awareness and put in place some stipulations about it. So I think that in the recent period, with respect to educational institutions and Yale, where I am, we've been talking a lot about that. And I think that is symptomatic kind of the broader thing that Yawei was talking about, which is, it's a very harsh climate right now for discussions of China in the United States. And, the Carter Center recently put out a report about, how civil society and non-governmental actors can work to improve U.S.-China relations. And, I think it's unfortunate that, they became the target of, sort of attacks and kind of scurrilous sort of, innuendo surrounding, where their funding was coming from and who was influencing them and this kind of thing. And it's really gotten a little bit out of control in the United States, with people investigating, who's getting funding from where, and are they an agent of the Chinese government, et cetera. It's really an extremely unhealthy direction for the United States to be going in its sort of research and discourse about China, the second largest economy and the largest country in the world. And I personally think that, there's a really inexplicable aura of emotion around U.S.-China relations discussions. And to me, it gets more to the psychology of Americans than anything else. I think we're in a difficult moment, obviously, right now in our country, and that China is somehow refracting through that prism. And so this sort of kind of look that we have at sort of Chinese Americans in various institutions in the United States is really something that I think we have to deal with quickly and get beyond. It's really not going to be positive for the United States, for the development of our society, for the development of our economy, and only as a sort of third area, not healthy for the development of U.S.-China relations. And I hope that as we move forward, there's been a lot of attention paid to the so-called China initiative at the Justice Department. And I hope that will be looked at by the new Justice Department officials and somehow put into a better course of action going forward.
Kerry, if there's anything that you'd like to add, yeah.
Yeah, universities obviously are in the firing line for all sorts of reasons in the culture wars. Presumably it's the same in America, but in Europe and certainly in Britain, universities are figured as kind of, elite-led entities that are sort of brainwashing the young to kind of believe in certain things. And I guess the China kind of is a sub kind of sort of area of that. As a director of an institute, focusing on China in the UK, I found it has become much more politicized. And we do everything we can to kind of keep out of, sort of being politicized, but it's impossible. You have to kind of at some point say, look, to kind of engage with the world's kind of second largest economy becoming largest economy, this isn't something that's negotiable. I mean, you have to do it. It's not like you can just ignore this, and you have to somehow kind of create a framework to deal with all of those issues as they come along. Today, Boris Johnson's brother, Joe Johnson, who was a previous Minister for Education, issued a report with some of my colleagues at King's Policy Institute on the enormous rise of joint research with Chinese partners from UK universities in the last 10 years. I think a 20-fold increase. And, in areas which are extremely important. Now, the report itself, which I had some input into, I mean, I talked to the authors, and I thought the report was very data-driven. It had really, really, kind of empirically led. And yet it's presented in some of the media in Britain as, a kind of warning that we shouldn't, be doing this with China or that with China. I mean, it says no such thing. It says that when you've got a new partner in such a quick way, of course, you've got to have some sort of risk management. That would be true of any partner. And there are things about dealing with Chinese research partners where you have to think quite deeply, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't deal with them. And in fact, in many areas, it's proper to deal with them on, public health issues, climate change. I mean, all sorts of things. It's going to be really important and very intellectually profitable, not commercially, intellectually profitable. But I think that this isn't going to be an easy message to convey in Europe and America. The European Union is trying also to create a framework where you don't obsess about, China as a place and a country that's got all these very terrible and specific kind of issues. You try and look at these things structurally and say, okay, how do we protect our main interests, but also work with others who can help, and who we can help. This is going to be quite a battle, but it's certainly a battle that I think we need to engage with as universities and as people who deal with China. And the final thing I think is that the area of China studies itself has become very divided. I mean, I can't remember in 20 years of sort of dealing as a diplomat and then as a kind of academic with this area, how bad it's got recently. I mean, it's really become a case of that you're seen as pro or anti, China. I have no idea what that means. I mean, am I pro the fact that China exists or anti the fact that China exists? I mean, that makes no more sense than saying I'm sort of pro or anti the sun rising in the morning. I mean, it's just going to happen whether I like it or not. So I feel like I have to kind of try and depoliticize as much as I can. But of course, it's a very, very tough battle. It's a tough, tough battle.
To respond to and Kerry said, I think when the FBI is telling the American public that every 10 hours, it opens an espionage case against a Chinese or a Chinese American, that's the kind of rhetoric, back in 1882 was turned into a Chinese Exclusion Act. And that hasn't been corrected. I think when Chenggang, Michael mentioned, was arrested, the Boston FBI guy, even though he retired now or resigned, made the same kind of accusation. Every 10 hours we open an espionage case against a Chinese or Chinese American. I mean, that, I think the Biden administration, I admire and praise the effort, the presidential memo on, no federal government official say anything about anti-Asian, anti-Chinese, rhetoric, but the China Initiative at the FBI probably has, its name has to change, and we need to see what exactly is going on. How many are being charged? I mean, all of those that are being charged, and no one was convicted of the original charge. They all plead guilty to a much lesser charge. So that's the climate. I think that has also made a lot of civil society, NGO, particularly of AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander organization, very active now. Committee of 100 and others. I think our report also mentioned that. Finally, I have a quick question for Emily. You said you want to report what you're interested in. Back at home, your editor, about your story. I remember during the earthquake, NPR reporter happened to be near Chengdu, and the stories she filed back was so moving, so much to tell about, what Chinese people are doing during disaster. But right now, is your editor politicized? That if something good about China, that story may not see the daylight?
This might be true only of NPR, but because I'm a one-person bureau, and we normally do have 2 bureaus in China, but because of COVID and US-China relations, we can't accredit our second correspondent. So because basically I'm one person covering greater China, so to speak, there is, for better or worse, a huge amount of trust based on my input of what I think is worth covering. And that's a big responsibility, but it also makes things even more subjective. My editor is a great editor. He is a skeptic of everything under the sun, including China, including the US, including India, where he's from. And that makes him a really good editor, but it means that I have to justify every editorial decision that I make. By and large, though, I get 100% latitude in the topics that I choose. Obviously, every week or 2 weeks or so, there is a news item that there's no way I cannot cover. For example, the National People's Congress and CPBCC meetings this week. That's just the Yawei 2 sessions is something that we have to pay attention to. But in between those kinds of events or natural disasters, I have enormous flexibility, and I'm really, really grateful for that.
Thanks.
Yawei, actually, I think we'd love to hear, your experience in NGOs, right? As obviously having worked with the Carter Center, what do you think U.S. and Chinese governments can do to make it easier for NGOs to operate now that we've heard about the state and academic institutions and in journalism?
Well, when Kerry said Susan was serving as a diplomat in the U.S. Embassy, we were observing village elections in China. So at that time, the Chinese government, I think Kerry also wrote about this grassroots democracy in China. We were given access to observe village elections, and we brought Susan with us, and we brought Thomas Friedman. I wrote a short commentary on bringing him to observe village elections and how excited he was when we heard a villager chair candidate talk about fiber optics and things like that. So that open-mindedness, that self-confidence of allowing NGOs, foreign NGOs, to come to China and to observe, to engage in other civil society empowerment activities, those days are gone. And because of that, the role we are playing, I think we made a huge impact, getting Americans and Westerners to learn more about China. I always like to say, before our involvement of observing elections in China, the State Department report on China was all very dark. After our involvement, there's always this bright spot about, local government innovation, governance innovation elections, and competitive elections at the village level to a certain extent. So we can play a very important role. But the thing is, in our report, we mentioned about the law passed by the Chinese People's Congress, the Foreign NGO Management Law, basically, moving the responsibility of regulating foreign NGOs from the Ministry of Civil Affairs to the Ministry of Public Security. That's potentially seeing every foreign NGO, including NGOs from Hong Kong and Taiwan and Macau, as foreign hostile force. That has to change. On the U.S. side, I think Susan mentioned, the political atmosphere, doesn't allow us to do an equally effective job. So both countries, if the government leaders don't want to see this relationship decline beyond repair, they should allow, their domestic political atmosphere to change so that NGOs in both countries, particularly in the U.S., because in China, because Chinese NGOs, they actually don't have equivalent of U.S. NGOs, but all the government media outlets and other organizations here in the U.S. now labeled as United Front Work organizations, which I think is also very counterproductive. So I think we can do a lot, but we will keep doing it. But if both governments are going to be more confident in their own system, more confident in taking and tolerating criticism, then the space is going to be a lot bigger for us.
Thanks, Yawei. Yawei, just quickly, thanks. Well, we've heard a lot of discussion of, like kind of Western perceptions on China and what's been going on in, academic institutions, NGOs, and Western journalism organizations. I think one thing I'd like to kind of pivot towards now is the situation in China. And I'd like to direct this question first at Kerry. But regarding, more nuanced discussions of China, I think we're often reminded that, American policymakers, despite the unity projected in international statements, that Chinese politics is actually riddled, with a lot of factional disputes. If you know where to look, most notably between groups of reformists and groups of more conservative nationalists. If you and everyone else in the panel could speak on how you guys understand these factions within the CCP, within Chinese society at large, and what kind of factors in the next few years might empower more reformist voices in the Chinese civil society, that'd be great.
Well, so first of all, I wouldn't be looking for reformers in inverted commas. I mean, I don't think when you use the word, reform in a kind of Chinese political context, it's an outsider might be looking for. We have been hunting for the benign reformers for 40 years and ended up with lots of very unexpected kind of, sort of outcomes. So I think we're looking for the wrong kind of thing, basically. I mean, it's clear that the consensus politically is to make one-party rule sustainable, because the Communist Party of China, in essence, is a risk management, body, and it's kind of got a very clear strategic objective, which has never really changed from 1949, although the tactics by which it's achieved or wanted to achieve the outcome of sustainable one-party rule obviously have changed. And I think it's a question of whether that outcome, if it's achieved, is it going to mean a kind of society in China which is radically different from that exists in Europe and America, but which is more, humane, more pluralistic, and one which is collaborative in, the international kind of order. So it is that China contributes something to a sense of order, which is not just, kind of derived from external kind of models. So it's a very collaborative project, and we need collaborative partnership for that. So, that's a huge, huge task to achieve. I think factional battles in China are, again, more what we might perceive than kind of reach the sort of reality of what I imagine doing politics in China is like. I think factionalism gives it a sort of neatness that I've never really managed to work out. I'll give you an example on the kind of current standing committee Politburo. You say Xi's people, and Xi's sort of people like Li Keqiang, who are not regarded as particularly close to Xi, but I think it never really made much sense. I look in terms of what people's abilities are and how they would have been selected on the basis of that. And obviously, there are figures like Wang Huning who've got ideological ability, which has been proved from the time of Jiang Zemin onwards. He belongs to the ideology, not to the Xi network. So I think, these kind of frameworks sometimes deployed on Chinese politics may block out things that actually, once we get rid of those frameworks or, kind of dull it, we could see more easily and actually would be more helpful. Politics in China is like politics anywhere. It's a game of winning and losing, and it's not really about anyone predeterminedly winning or losing. They've got to play the game well.
Would anyone else like to jump in? I guess, Emily, specifically, have you covered any kind of differences in domestic politics in China, and what does it look like?
As Susan said, it depends on the issue because it's so diverse here in terms of approach, motivation, and are you talking about elite Chinese politics?
Yeah,
issues.
Have you covered any differences between factions within the CCP specifically?
For NPR, no. And the reason behind that is it's really difficult to bring that to audio life. I mean, how do you tell that story in audio without being able to interview any of the people that you're talking about or anyone who knows them, and not having to rely on a bunch of talking heads who may know quite a lot about party history but are not there in the room, so to speak. So no, not really extensively, which is disappointing because that's what drives some of the, that's what steers the ship 1 degree to the left or 1 degree to the right. It may not affect day-to-day life every day here in China, but it's certainly an important topic. I mean, for example, with the Lianghui, the 2 sessions that's going on right now, there has been absolutely no access. I mean, the best that I could have done would be to quarantine overnight, get COVID tested, and attend the opening ceremonies for either of the 2 bodies that are meeting, but then attend none of the plenary sessions, and there are no press conferences after any of the plenary sessions, unlike in 2019, where it was very tightly managed, increasingly so. I think the first party congress, or not party congress, excuse me, I did cover the party congress in 2017. The first Lianghui I covered would have been in 2016, 17. And that was okay. You could still kind of, like corner delegates in the Great Hall of the People and try to get a few words from them. And by 2018, 2019, they had clearly very strict orders to just look forward and keep walking. And then because of COVID, we have had absolutely no access.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah, Susan.
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is something that is so interesting about US views of China. We tend to focus in on these personalities, right? I mean, the most sort of popular story about Chinese politics currently still even is Bo Xilai. You still see things being written about the Bo Xilai, case and this sort of high drama of that. I really think it's so interesting why we focus in on sort of these individual charismatic personalities in China when here we are, this kind of bastion of democratic, politics, not supposed to be sort of overly enamored of kind of charismatic personalities. And I just think it's just the sort of wrong frame for looking at Chinese politics. I've always thought so. Certainly now recently there's a lot of focus on Xi Jinping. Everything's about, he decides everything. He is, the ultimate sort of decision maker on even small minutia. And it's just so unrealistic when you think about 24 hours in a day and that the Chinese leaders, and particularly Xi Jinping, is probably overwhelmingly focused on personnel issues, frankly. Probably spends half an hour a day or maybe an hour a day on foreign policy, as opposed to the sort of division of time of the US president, for example. It's just in a way, a different system. And I think the thing to focus on is how effectively can the system adjust to problems that come up. And I think there, we haven't really focused on that issue. And, how well can China adapt to change? Because, of course, they've identified that change is coming, that we have, changes unseen in a century and this kind of thing, and major looming challenges ahead, and they're going to have to adjust and change. And I think in the US, we tend to see this as a pretty sclerotic and, kind of rigid bureaucracy, but that hasn't really been borne out to be shown to be the case, especially recently, and certainly in comparison with the ability of the US system to reform and change. And so I think, we need to focus probably less on this issue of factions, which I've never, I covered internal politics when I was in Beijing, and I could never find the evidence of this that people were always talking about. I mean, I'm still open-minded about it. I remain to be convinced. Obviously, there are politics in China, as Kerry said, and they're probably pretty rough and tumble. But this idea of sort of two sides lining up against each other like Democrats and Republicans, I just think it doesn't really capture it. And I just think we need to focus in more on how is it that they're able to make these changes given the system that they have? And, where is that going to take them in the future? I mean, I personally think, yes, Xi Jinping is a person that came into leadership for a certain reason. He's probably going to be there for longer than we anticipated at the beginning, but it doesn't mean that China's, locked into any certain pattern and going to be in any kind of long-term unchangeable state. And so I think we need to, keep focused on that and keep working around the edges at what we can do to, as Kerry said, the main thing is to get China to some equilibrium within the international system that everybody can live with. And that's the real challenge. And we need to focus in on that. What are the areas of the international system that China is transgressing? How can we get it to see its interests as a sort of enlightened self-interest as opposed to just hard self-interest that we see so often in Chinese behavior? And, these are things that we can do, but it's going to take nuance, and it's going to take a little bit less emotion and a little bit more kind of hard-headed look at what needs to be done.
I'll make a quick comment. I think study Chinese politics is a huge challenge. As Kerry can tell everyone, it's hard. But I think this year, and particularly next year, it will be good time to observe what is going to unfold. So if we turn our time back to 2012, no one could have imagined, so many things happened in that year. I often commented that if you want to write a political fiction about China, you could not have imagined what happened in that year. So next year, then there will be a lot of personnel decisions, and these decisions do matter. So it will be a good time for China watchers to see, what is going to, when they celebrate the centennial of the party, and then next year moving to the 20th National Congress of the party. It's a good time to observe. Now back to Kerry, you mentioned, it takes partnership and collaborative effort to study Chinese politics. Is that feasible now? I know in the past, professors from Central Party schools, they invited you guys to lecture, and they come here, they go to UK, they attend meetings. I guess, COVID and even before COVID, they're not available to you guys, right? It's hard to get into a collaborative study of the Chinese politics, is it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good point. And maybe I think what I'm most excited by and interested in now are generic issues like the environment, like mental health, where actually you can really have a good dialogue with Chinese partners, and you don't probably need to go to the party school. I mean, but in fact, in policy terms, mental health is going to be as big a problem is as huge a problem in China as it is in Britain and probably in America. And I mean, I'm sort of, this sounds a very strange thing to say, but I'm optimistic in the sense that climate change is such a vast and epic problem and of such importance that I think it will be the common ground that will maybe solve some of these other issues, because it will overshadow them and just bring people into one common space. And I think it's deeply significant that Biden's presidency and Xi Jinping's sort of leadership and Europe are broadly in the same space on this one. I think it's absolutely, that's the place where we will be able to build. I don't see politics, elsewhere being particularly optimistic at the moment, but that space. Thanks.
Thanks, all of you, for that. That was really insightful. One thing I want to now kind of step back towards is, all eyes are on US and China, right? We talk about the US and China specifically and the kind of battle they're engaged in, but every other country in the world is also watching. And I want to direct this question first at you, Susan. The differences between what we've experienced in the past 4 years and what we're about to experience now with the new president of the US, Joe Biden, versus President Trump. Biden's been quick to reverse some of Trump's anti-immigration policies, but he's been slower in reversing some of Trump's regulations on China, specifically Chinese companies. what aspects of Trump's legacy do you think China do you think Biden will keep? And more importantly, as the world is watching, how do you think the attractiveness of democracy has been affected? How attractive do you think rules-based constitutional democracy is in Asia after 4 years of the previous administration? How should that affect Biden's pivot to Asia approach?
Yeah, thanks. I think, there are a lot of things about the Trump administration and that will never be able to put right again in terms of the U.S. position and role in the world. It's sort of example that the Biden people talk about all the time. A foreign colleague of mine, I won't mention which country, but was quite stunning to me and sort of very sad, said to me on a dialogue, it was during the transition actually. So Biden had already been elected, but said, we used to see the US as a generous country. And, that is going to be really hard to put right again. People are going to be suspicious and
I think we've just lost Susan for a moment here. Hopefully she can rejoin, but would anyone else like to kind of plug in on this topic in a moment?
Let me make a quick
time,
comment.
I think Susan's back. Great. Oh, Susan, we've lost you for a moment, but I think we have you again. So
can you hear me?
Yeah, we've just missed maybe like the past 15 seconds of what you were saying. So if you could please repeat yourself, that'd be great.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think there are things that we have to overcome from the Trump administration, but what I see the Biden people focusing in on is this real domestic effort at self-strengthening and repairing our kind of fabric of our democracy at home. I think, democracy is not going to lose its appeal in the world. I don't think that really the contest between the US and China is about ideology. I don't see that the Chinese so-called ideology, however you want to characterize it, which is also part of their problem. I think it's quite difficult to characterize what China's ideology is, but I don't think it's very attractive or repeatable, in other countries. And, I've served in a lot of places around the world. I really don't think it's really the system of governance, which is different. And it's not really able to be kind of, cut and pasted into some other cultural milieu. So I think, the emphasis on ideological competition is good for strengthening U.S. bonds with its like-minded partners, which is going to be very important for this effort to, repair and strengthen the international system, which is the most important area for all of us to focus on. And how important a role sort of the promotion of democracy, quote unquote, is going to play in that. I don't know. I think, the speech of Tony Blinken, he talked about sort of promoting democracy and said, we're not going to do it, by virtue of sort of regime change with a military emphasis. And I think, so that gives you some indication that the Biden team is aware of the sort of skepticism of democracy promotion efforts around the world. And yet democratic self-strengthening is something that they're certainly going to be focused on. I think, it's more important, though, in my view, to sort of focus on the actual nuts and bolts of things that need to be done in the international system, fixing the WTO, getting regulations around new weapons and new technologies. These are kind of practical problems. Kerry mentioned climate change, which is the colossal challenge that we all face. Working on practical problems is really the way to go forward. And this focus on ideology, in my view, it's a kind of an outgrowth of a bit of U.S. insecurity that we need to sort of leave behind and overcome in the Biden era.
Thanks, Susan. Would anyone else from the panel like to?
Yeah, let me make a quick comment on the the bilateral relationship between U.S. and China is the most consequential that the whole world is watching. While I agree this is the most consequential bilateral relationship, maybe at this point, both leaders in China and the U.S. should leave this relationship alone for a while and don't be so possessed by this, because there are other countries, there are other parts of the world that both countries can work with. On the U.S. side, Biden team is emphasizing on rebuilding, renewing the alliance system. I think for China, there, at least at the think tank level, there's growing call to de-Americanize so-called decision-making, 去美国化, that the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party has focused too much on the United States. There is space outside this relationship that China can pivot to. The investment agreement with the EU, I think that's a huge leap. The RCEP is another. I think China probably can focus more on solving the problems with other countries, improve your relationship with Australia, improve your relationship with Japan, with all the European countries that have such a dim view of you, and then come back to look at the U.S.-China relationship. Because right now, it doesn't matter what China leaders are shouting, and there's just no response from the U.S. side. So I think we shouldn't be devoting maybe too much. I shouldn't say this, but it has come to the point that leave this relationship alone for a few weeks, a few months, and try to fix other things, as Susan has just suggested.
But I think that's a good sentiment, Yawei, but I don't think it's going to happen, is it? It's not going to be left alone. Do you really think that's realistic? What else are people going to be looking at if they're not agonizing over this?
No, I think China can go to the European countries, and just as I think the former French ambassador to China, when they said, that investment agreement, is going to take each and every country parliament to approve it. It's not going to happen overnight. And her response is, China has made real serious concessions in this agreement. I just don't understand why each and every European country is not going to approve it. I think that should be the approach China is taking, is that you go to these countries and you tell them, what do you want me to reform or to change? And these countries certainly will tell China, and maybe I'm too idealistic over here. I think that should be the approach China is going to take while waiting for the Biden administration to take serious policy initiatives, because right now there's just nothing. The other thing, before Susan gets her two finger, is practical issues. I always go to the China side and say, you talk about cooperation. Now, give me one case of cooperation that you're going to work with the U.S., or can you really propose one to the U.S.? Kerry talked about climate change. Susan helped us actually on this. We tried to get U.S.-China to cooperate in Africa. We had meetings in Africa. We tried to get both governments to come together. After the Ebola joint effort, I thought that was easy. It was not. Both, particularly the China side, you always said we like to cooperate. But I said, can you just go to the USA, let's work on Ethiopia. There is a civil war going on here. Could the two countries work to mediate, as the two countries did in the case of South Sudan? Just give me something, or give us something that, to demonstrate that your call for cooperation is sincere and serious.
Yeah, I just want to say, Yawei, I am feeling your pain. And the thing is that right now, the U.S.-China relationship is so politicized that it's, even though I say cooperate on practical issues, it's almost impossible because the coverage of even cooperation on a practical issue, even if it's mutually beneficial, it will be distorted because it's going to be seen through this lens of, extreme competition, and it's really hard. So that's why, you say, let's leave it alone for a while, because there's almost no way to make even a good thing at this point. But I also am concerned, as Kerry mentions, are people going to really leave it alone? No, they're not. And what's going to fill that void? It's going to be more of this extremely negative coverage of the relationship that is going to drive public opinion. I mean, we may already be at a place where we can't bring it back. And what does that mean for the future relationship of these two giant, countries? As someone from Southeast Asia said the other day, there's only two suns in the sky now. I think, it's the U.S. is still, frankly, in my view, the sun that shines more brightly. But, that is the view of most people in countries around the world, that we've got now these two giant countries. They seem implacably hostile and opposed to one another, and everybody knows they're going to be caught up in it. And it's very hard to see, although I'm worried about the absence of communication or any positive reference to this relationship, I really don't see how we can get it in the near future. And so, I don't know what I can hope for at the moment, except I hope for a little bit more positive inclination slowly over time that doesn't generate a backlash, and maybe somehow we can get back to it that way.
Great. Thanks, Susan, Yawei, Kerry. Emily, is there anything else you'd like to add? If not, just being mindful of time, I'm going to ask our last question after this.
Really quickly, Susan, I hear what you're saying about negative coverage. I think that if you look at any of the outlets, at least the ones that I read, that I can read in Chinese or English, among the foreign correspondents at least, despite the lack of resources here, I think the coverage has been pretty comprehensive. Unfortunately, I do think the issues that get the most clicks are obviously the ones that illustrate this great power rivalry, even if that's not the only story that's happening on the ground. I do sort of defensively want to push back. I think that coverage has been overall really positive, or has been quite comprehensive. When I can, I try to do fun stories. There's just not that much time for that. And I think one of the big frustrations in wanting to cover good news about China is that on the big issues that matter, the substantive foreign policy issues that the US cares about in its relationship, right now, those being, I think, and also the most newsworthy items being Hong Kong and Xinjiang, China has gone back on agreements, it's staged media tours, it's not that diplomats arrange their own visits. And in the grand scheme of the US-China relationship, those are not big issues. They don't affect the American way of life. But it says so much about how much we can trust the country, whether there is an amount of credibility that can lead to some kind of buildup of trust that we've talked about over the last 90 minutes, that is not there. I've been really, really shocked by European perceptions of China post Hong Kong, post how China handled the 2019 anti-extradition protests, how China implemented the national security law. It has been extremely negative, as you know, and I think it's because it gets to the heart of, can we trust Beijing? And although Hong Kong has no effect really on the lives of Europeans, on the lives of Americans, it's taken as a litmus test, as a canary in the coal mine of what further cooperation with China might look like. And that might not be accurate, but that is public perception out there. And I wish that were different, because it would mean that I would have more variety in the stories that I cover.
Susan, would you like to respond to that? Or?
Yeah, I'm not. Well, I think what I was talking about is more of a sort of a leader level kind of. I mean, what we would like, I think, to see is a little bit more political leadership on this issue. And it seems like the political space in the US is just so narrow on China that nobody's willing to go into that space. And you've got plenty of people occupying the rest, the negative side of the space. And so I see what Yawei is talking about is the leave it alone. And that is what our political leadership is doing. It's leaving it alone. We're in sort of this pause. We're not really talking about China in any way from the official spokesperson's microphone in any way other than majorly negative ways. And I think that if you're going to try to lead a little bit in a positive direction and start opening some space, you're going to need to see that change. But for right now, it's certainly not changing.
Now, let me respond. I think Kerry initially mentioned knowledge and context. I think the media plays a role, and of course, academics like Kerry and Susan now also play a role. Is how do you understand these volatile issues? Hong Kong. All the report we see is the grotesque violation of human rights in Hong Kong, but there's no report on why the young people in Hong Kong are so angry. When the mainland policy toward Hong Kong was relatively moderate, why they kept demonstrating, why they became so vandalistic, where did that anger come from? Is it just political, or it has a lot to do with Hong Kong's economic situation? The rising prices of the halls, the possibility that they're not going to be hired after graduation, all these things. So I think knowledge and balance and the saga of BBC, I think that they can all inform us of the media coverage, whether it's balanced and fair. I certainly don't agree with the Chinese Foreign Ministry's response to the FCC report. When you read that response, he said, I have never heard of this organization. I don't know what you are talking about. When the foreign reporters asked about, the report that Emily mentioned before. So I think both sides are responsible for this kind of dead end, that no movement whatsoever on the relationship, and also in terms of trying to arrest this slide of public negative view of China.
Yeah, if anyone else would like to respond, please feel free to do so now. Otherwise, we're going to move to our last question. Yeah, it looks like we're good. So yeah, I mean, this has been great, but it'd be an honor if I had the chance to be able to continue this for more hours. But I'm sure you guys also have other things in your schedules as well. And our last question that I'd like each of you to kind of address in your own way is that, in general, we've talked a lot about misunderstandings, both between Chinese society and American society. But the question we'd like to hear, from you guys today is, if there was one misconception of China that you wished more Americans understood, especially those involved in policymaking with media or in academia, what would that be? And how can we go about in combating that? If we could please start with Kerry first.
Well, I'm the one non-American, so I'm going to really put my foot in it now. I think the thing that was said earlier, which we discussed, and Susan mentioned about the idea that China is just one guy, Xi Jinping, making all these decisions, and it's a very neat story. And I suppose it would be good to just have more appreciation of that. This is not a kind of monolithic story. It's more about complexity. And I think that's true of European leaders too, just, kind of, and the public, that this is a complex story that needs a complex response. It's not, kind of uniform. Thanks.
Well, I guess I can go next, and I'll just be really quick. I mean, I think that the issue of strategic empathy is really important. People assume that the Chinese system is evil, the Chinese government is evil, and that they're just doing these bad things around the world and to their own citizens. And I think it's very important, if you're going to really try to make an effort to understand, which I wish a lot of more Americans would, China, because I think it's so important for all of our future and our children's future. You really have to sort of try to look at things from their perspective, and you have to try to give a little bit of benefit of the doubt to the government in China that they're really trying to be responsible and do things to serve their own citizens and country's interests. You may think they have that wrong, but to try to look at it from their perspective more, and not just sort of have this caricature of the government there, is what I would hope for people to try to do.
Well, if I can make a decision or change the perception, I think I would like Americans and Europeans to think China that this is a country. It doesn't have an evil plan to overthrow the global order. It has benefited from that global order. It would like to see that order sustained and maintained, maybe with some measures of reform. Secondly, China cannot overtake the United States in the next decade or so, even though a lot of people would say China's economy is going to be bigger. And I think that's just no useless talk. Thirdly, I hope President Biden's view of China can be put into operation. And I think he has this very objective view of China when he talked about, there's corruption in China, there are mountains on the west, there's oceans on the east, and China is not going to be able to do a lot of damage. And China really doesn't intend to undermine American democratic values. All China concerned, about this influence operation, things like that, is its sense of insecurity, that its sensitivity to criticism. It just doesn't want people to criticize it, but it's not going to mess up the American political system or to destroy freedom of speech on American campuses. I don't think that's even achievable. Thanks.
As a corollary to what the three speakers before me have just said, I always get the question of, we do hear a lot of awful things about the state of free speech, of foreign correspondents in China. Are you censored all the time? Are you being watched wherever you go? And I think a very common misperception is, one, that the party somehow controls everything, and that nothing spontaneous is possible here, which is patently false. I mean, despite the increasing restrictions in many levels of civil society, people are resourceful. China is an incredibly large, diverse, and resourceful country. And there's still a lot happening here that is completely of the free will of the Chinese people. There are a lot of very interesting political experiments and policies happening locally. And journalists on the ground, no matter what language they publish in Chinese or in English, still manage to get out very, very interesting stories. So I think there's a lot of possibilities for, and I'm biased here, I think journalists are always pro-engagement, but I think there's a lot to be said still of economic, political, and media engagement with China, because there is still a certain amount of space to work here. And there's a lot that happens that I think people in the US would be surprised that happens, because there's a lot of tolerance at various levels, even in Beijing, and particularly outside of Beijing. So things here are not dead. There's still very much a lot of life and a lot of interesting people talking about the US, about US-China relations, and have interesting ideas here.
Thank you so much to the four of you. I think it's only unfortunate really for me that this has to come to an end. But this has been an amazing discussion. I certainly feel like I've learned more in the past hour and a half than I have in a week of university, but that's not a testament to the teaching at my university. That's just a testament to me as a student. I would like to, thank everybody for joining this panel on civil society and US-China relations. It's been an absolute pleasure, and to thank all our viewers for joining. We've heard from Dr. Yawei Liu, the senior advisor at the Carter Center and member of the Council of Foreign Relations, Professor Susan Thornton, former US diplomat and senior fellow at Yale University's Pol Sci China Center, Emily Feng, Beijing Correspondent NPR, and Professor Kerry Brown, Professor of Chinese Studies at the Lau China Institute at King's College London. Thank you again to all of you, and to all our viewers. Please check out the video on YouTube afterwards. You can always go back and see what our wonderful guests have said. You can find OPR on Twitter and Facebook. And finally, please check out our website at oxfordpoliticalreview.com. Currently, you can find Kerry and Yawei's writing on there, and hopefully soon to feature Emily and Susan's writing as well. And obviously, we'd love to keep the relationship between OPR and all of you, and more than welcome to have you all on again if you all have the time. So thank you so much for being here, and I hope all of you have a great day.